Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where this broadcast finds you. I'm letting everyone get settled in. It looks like a couple others are still getting connected to audio, so we'll let them get settled in here virtually, and we'll get started. I am going to close my office door as well. Better do that. Now that we have a few people in the building, I don't have the whole place to myself any longer. Well, again, I just want to let everyone get settled in. It looks like Paulette is still getting connected to audio, so let's give her just a minute to get connected there, and then we'll get started. Great to see everyone. We've got a really great speaker today and a very interesting topic that I'll introduce here in a moment. We're just waiting for Paulette to get connected. I know sometimes connectivity is a challenge. And we'll, Jeff, let's make sure too we have the waiting room disabled, so if folks come in later, they're not trapped in the virtual waiting room. We'll give Paulette just a couple more minutes here, and then we'll get started. Yeah, Jeff, maybe reach out to Paulette too and see if she'd prefer to call in. We might, if she's having trouble, maybe we could offer her a call-in number, and she could try calling in and at least have stable audio. We're going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully Paulette will get connected here momentarily. As I said, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where this broadcast finds you this morning. My name is Steve Steiny. I am broadcasting to you live from the University of Iowa here on campus in Iowa City, Iowa. Today we are featuring our essential substance abuse skills training. Today's topic is adolescent brain maturation and health intersections on the developmental highway. Our speaker today is Ken Winters. Ken is a consultant of ours here at our American Indian Alaska Native, National American Indian Alaska Native ATTC. I'm happy to call him a colleague and a friend. I've worked with him now for a couple of years, and he's worked for our center for many years with Dr. Shinstad. So I have just a few slides I'll go through today. Then I'll turn the floor over to Ken so he can get started on his presentation. Again, thank you for joining us today. As most of you know, this event is brought to you by the National American Indian Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center. We are located at the University of Iowa, and we are part of a larger national ATTC network that includes 10 regional centers, a national Hispanic Latino center, and a coordinating office at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. This project is funded and supported by SAMHSA. The content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed in today's presentation do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the National American Indian Alaska Native, ATTC. At the end of today's event, we will also share a link to our evaluation survey in the chat box. This survey is very important to our center and to our funders. It ensures that we're able to continue to provide events such as this to all of you. Your participation, of course, is voluntary, but we would really appreciate just taking a few minutes to fill out this very short survey. You can skip any questions you would like, and all the responses are kept confidential and cannot be linked to you in any way. If you have any concerns about this survey, please reach out to myself or Jeff Ladolter, who is also with our center. He is on the call today supporting us. If you're having trouble with any audio or video issues, please reach out to Jeff in the chat and he'll try and resolve those for you. I know we are gathered here virtually today, but I wanted to take a few moments to acknowledge the land and pay respects to the indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. Please take a few moments to read this land acknowledgement, which was created by 3 members of our team, Ella and Keely Driscoll, and our co-director, Sean Baer. Thank you. I want to introduce our speaker today. I will also remind you that you're currently muted. Please use the chat box feature to make comments or ask questions that you have. What we're hoping to do, Ken and I and Jeff will circle back to any questions you have, and we're going to try and reserve a little time at the end for Ken to field any questions from you directly. So you can either post your question in the chat or post it and then unmute yourself at the end and you can ask the question directly. So I wanted to put that out there before I turn the floor over. Today's speaker is Ken Winters. He is, as I said earlier, he's been a consultant to the National American Indian Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center for several years. He's a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute. Previously was a professor Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota, where he founded and directed the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research for a quarter century. His primary research interests are adolescent health, with a focus on substance abuse and co-occurring mental and behavioral disorders. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Ken Winters. I consider him a colleague and of course a friend as well. So Ken, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to pull my slides down and allow you to get yours going. And the floor is yours, sir. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Excellent. Steve, thanks for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Just to kick it off, just a reminder, I don't have any professional disclosures to report. Before I get into the core content, a little bit about some resources if you want to dig into this topic in more depth. A free resource from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. There's the link for the PDF to download. The Promise of Adolescence, a great overview of what we know about adolescent development, including plenty on brain development, but also on many other important psychological and social phenomenon. It highlights the importance of assets and resiliency, something I'll be talking a lot about today, and of course, quite important to youth development. 2 books. Now, these are cost items, but they are, I think, well-written and very amenable to non-technical audiences. David Walsh's book, Why Do They Act That Way, is a bit dated, but it's still a good read. He wrote it thinking both of parents and the teenager in the home. So quite user-friendly, reader-friendly. Then there's Anthony Wolf's book, Get Out of My Life, but then the subtitle says, but first, can you drive me and Cheryl to the mall? A pretty good subtitle that in some ways reflects many facets of adolescent brain development and some of the behaviors that we see among teens that tend to be on the excessive end of the spectrum, perhaps with reflecting more emotionality than we might see when someone's an adult. More on all of that soon. There's a lot of YouTube videos on brain development. This to me was one that I really liked. It's a TED Talk by a professor from England, Sarah Jane Blakemore. It's about 15 to 20 minutes, but does a nice job of overviewing what we know about the science of adolescent brain development and how we can use that information to understand teenage behavior, whether you're a parent or whether you're a service provider working in prevention or treatment. Then there is a very approachable podcast series from Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And so their new series, which is updated regularly, is called The Brain Architects. You can see from my quote there that it's aimed at educating you and informing you about the science behind how brains are built and what it means to build a strong one. So if you just Googled Harvard Center on Developing Child, you will see all kinds of links, and go to the podcast link, and you can go to their resource and get regular updates of when that podcast is updated. 2 cautionary notes. My first one is just to remind you that I'm spotlighting brain development and its impact on adolescent behavior, but that doesn't mean I'm diminishing the impact of experiences from the environment and social determinants on youth. It's of course not just brain development that's impacting adolescent behavior. I will bring into the mix today some of the important environmental and psychosocial factors that intersect with brain development. But it's more of a slanted perspective on brain development you'll get from me today, but I don't want you to think that that means that that's a predominant influencer on adolescent adolescent behavior. It's a mix, an interesting and complex mix of genes, neurobiology, and environment that leads us to understand how youth behave as well as humans in general. Then another cautionary note, and that is that the science on adolescent brain maturation is still relatively young, and a lot of the studies have small samples, and many of them do not have very diverse participants in those studies. So we have to proceed cautiously when we think about conclusions. I don't know of any science yet that has made a claim that brain development is largely different or significantly different just based on ethnicity or race. Experiences will have an impact, which we'll talk about. But so far, nothing that I know of that has pointed to ethnicity or race as being a major mediator of how the brain develops. There is some interesting differences in gender. Girls in gender differ a little bit from boys. That's coming up. But nothing on the ethnicity race topic. So I don't know of anything that suggests, well, if you're native, your brain's going to develop in significantly different ways than if you're not native. The science is going to improve when the very large longitudinal study being conducted in the US has more years to draw some and produce some yield of findings. So this ABCD study, called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is a national longitudinal study, has been underway for about 5 years. It's probably going to get funding for many, many years, so that these young children that were recruited at baseline at a very young age, 9 to 10, can be followed as they grow up during adolescence and young adulthood. And this study is measuring just probably hundreds of variables, and it's surely going to look at the impact of substance use on brain development, as well as a range, just a host of experiences. So so far, not a big yield where I can say the ABCD study has confirmed the following. You know, I suppose in a few years when I give a talk like this, I'll be able to say things like that. But it's hopeful, because this relatively immature science is really going to get strengthened as this study unfolds. Here's 3 teen brain development quiz questions. And we'll return to them later. And throughout my talk, hopefully you'll see answers, or at least some insights into answers to these questions. Question 1, it's a true-false one. There are several health indices suggesting that teenagers take less risk than in past years. True or false? Second one, what lifestyle choices during adolescence promote good brain development? The third is a multiple choice. Which is more harmful to the developing brain? Chronic heavy use of marijuana or chronic heavy drinking? More on these later. So I've organized my talk in the following way. The first 3 topic areas are the core content, and then I summarize at the end. So just keep in mind, there is a lot on background to brain development, but hang in there because I'm trying to inform how youth service providers, whether you're in the prevention or treatment field or working in the classroom, working in juvenile justice, how some of this information can be of value to you and strengthen the work you're doing. I've got 3 main points for my talk. I thought I'd give you those right up front. Number 1, the maturation of the adolescent brain likely contributes to behaviors. And I think it likely contributes in important ways to behaviors that are characteristic of this developmental period. I think when we understand this maturation, it also helps inform our understanding of young people and their risk for either a substance use problem or other behavioral or mental disorders. And then youth service providers can leverage this science about teen brain maturation when working with adolescents and parents. And there are 6 ways for this point about how you can take this information and use it. I'm going to give you the 6 right now, and then later you'll get a lot more detail, but I want to whet your appetite. Teaching young people about brain development, I think, is an interesting science, and it gets young people to think about health in important ways, and hopefully actually improves their health decisions. But the underlying science, I think, is of value to young people. And it's an interesting way, I think, to engage them in typical prevention topics. So I kiddingly say, well, all right, I've got a classroom of young people, let's say middle grade, I got 8th graders. I can give a talk on just say no about drugs, or I can give a talk about teen brain development and how that's important to their health. So that latter topic, I think, is going to be more engaging to young people. There are now so much evidence on what is good prevention that we can say that we know about the key principles of evidence-based prevention programs. And so using them are excellent ways to implement prevention that is teen brain friendly, because these prevention programs that are evidence-based, they have capitalized on what they know engage young people to be interested in health topics and to promote change. And that is one way you are being teen brain friendly when you're working with young people in prevention programs. There's a principle about how earlier the treatment, the better the outcome. Is perhaps a no-brainer for all those on the webinar today. But I'll bring that to bear, and how that really does help the teen brain also if you can treat early when there is a problem. And we're also learning about what are evidence-based treatment strategies. And these, like the evidence-based prevention programs, tend to be very teen brain friendly. I'll highlight some of those approaches that I think are particularly friendly and amenable to adolescents and help them engage in your behavior change efforts. The 5th one is helping teenagers better understand some of what I call the newest threats to young people in making decisions about whether they use or don't use substances. And the 2 big threats to me are cannabis and vaping, whether it's vaping, cannabis, or nicotine. So I call this increasing the youth cannabis and vaping IQ, and addressing some of the misperceptions and myths they may have about cannabis and vaping. So many myths and perceptions, I think, are way biased towards the fact that they're not harmful or harmless and much better than other drugs, etc. And many of these myths are worthy of attention and getting young people to perhaps think a little deeper on those topics. And the last one is the role of parents and how they can help with promoting good brain development in their youngster. And there's a lot of principles that you can teach parents that are on one level just great parenting practices, and on another level they help promote brain development. A brief primer on what is adolescent brain development. So I'm going to go through some of the basic principles. One big principle, and many of us, I think, know this by now. I see this so often in print, whether it's the scientific literature or in the popular press. Brain continues to mature in important ways until about age 25. So that's a bit of a news bulletin, since everyone thought when they looked at the science that brain development was pretty much complete by around age 12 was the earlier misperception. But we now know that it continues in important ways throughout adolescence. Now, a lot of it is complete by around 18 or 19. So but there is this young adult era, 19 to 24, 19 to 25, where there's still important maturation going on. The second big principle is the maturation doesn't occur equally across regions of the brain. And so what's happening is the regions that tend to be associated with action and emotion and motivation, it's called the limbic system. I call it the Nike part of the brain, kind of the brain that says, let's just do it, let's go for it. That matures faster. That's maturing at a faster rate than the other big general region of the brain, the more front part of the brain, or prefrontal cortex. The thoughtful part of the brain, that matures a little slower. So you have this imbalance, and to some degree, the Nike part of the brain is dominating over the pausing, thoughtful part of the brain. So this young man here is enjoying himself with a bungee jump, one that's revved up a bit. It's not your just average bungee jump where you're up high and you just drop straight down with a cord. This entertainment provides you a bike up on a ramp, and you get to ride the bike off the ramp. So you're going nice speed, and then you launch yourself out. You drop the bike here, but you get to kind of head out into space like Superman. The teen brain probably is lighting up in predictable ways when they're looking at this or doing it. So the limbic or Nike system is probably having a lot of fun with this, and may even have told the teenager, don't worry about any fears you have, which might be coming from the front part of your brain, just go for it. This is a time-lapse representation of one of the major brain maturation processes called pruning. And you can see it as the bluing occurs, that's the maturation. It's a time-lapse process that's stitched together from a series of brain scans from young people ages 5 to 20. And so not the same people, but they synthesized several successive brain scans from a large group of individuals that varied in age, and they put it together that shows you what it might look like if you could quickly look at a time-lapse maturation of a young person. So the parts that are getting blue the quickest here is the limbic, and the parts that get blue the last or near the end of this would be the prefrontal decision-making section of the brain. So Nike first, and the thoughtful decision-making more near the end. Here's an interesting way of looking at it from a couple authors. They put this together with a schematic, looking at the sort of the legal maturation picture we have in westernized society when it comes to age, and then looking at cognitive abilities, both with or without emotional arousal. So on the top left that I put in a red box, this represents the schematic of how we view giving rights and privileges to young people as they age. And you can see that, during your teen years, there's very few, but as you get closer to 18 and into adulthood, developmentally, you are ascribed more rights and privileges, or you reach a higher level of age of majority. 18 being a big one in the United States, for example, and 21 probably being the second biggest one. But then the next two show cognitive capacity. One is without emotional arousal, right here, and this reflects the fact that, okay, in a cognitive strength perspective, on a cognitive strength level or ability, young people advance or mature developmentally in much the same way that we ascribe important rights and privileges. And so that in some ways speaks to the rationality behind where we put age of majority for various privileges in society: driving, voting, being in the military, having financial independence, etc. But the last box reflects an important mediating factor. So under emotional situations, or when you're emotionally aroused or excited, the cognitive ability developmentally of young people is relatively flipped in some ways from the cognitive capacity without emotionality. Or in some ways you might say it's compromised. It's very different, and you don't achieve full developmental maturity until, according to this chart, after 21. But you can see during the throes of adolescence how you're perceiving things and decisions you make. While you might have the cognitive strength to make a good decision under some emotional situations, you might act in some ways that are not wise or are reckless. When developmental psychologists have looked at brain development science, they have tried to weigh in on how this might help us understand adolescent behavior. So our research staff years ago summarized this developmental psychology literature, and we came up with these 8 principles, and there's 3 subcategories, but all of them suggest certain kinds of tendencies or biases, if you will, during adolescence. They're all part of normal human behavior and with us throughout the developmental lifespan. But the notion is that these 8 features tend to dominate a bit more during adolescence as opposed to during adulthood, when things might be a bit more balanced. So let's take number 4, for example, novelty. Well, we all like novelty, and all of us generally respond to novelty, find it rewarding. We're pulled into it by the marketplace. But the notion is the adolescent brain is very sensitive and attentive to novelty, and thus teenagers may overreact to novelty, make decisions way based on novelty more so than considering other features. I won't go through all of them, but I'm going to highlight these from 2 perspectives. One is how taking risks. I'm going to go right to here first. One is the importance of these features and how we might think of it in a positive light. So I've highlighted in green these 5 features, and I thought of them in the light of that they can help promote positivity in a young person as they grow up. They may be promoters of personal growth and help you become more mature, help you do a better job when you're adult, help you prepare for adulthood. And one of them is in taking risk, because there is good risk and healthy risk, and not always just reckless or bad or dangerous risk. But then one could also go to the other side. And so I thought of the list of 8. and looked at it, well, which ones contribute maybe to unhealthy or unwise decision making and might lead to substance use or overexposure to things that could lead to mental health issues. And so more on my list got highlighted in red. And these are things that when done perhaps in excess or without context and without support from others, they may lead to problems, health problems. But the last one on the list, risk-taking, showed up both red and green. Maybe you didn't notice that, and I think it's such a key feature of adolescence as well as human behavior. I thought it'd be interesting to just do a little sidebar and focus in on it a bit. So that has been a focus of a lot of developmental psychologists. And I think the most informed view indicates that for adolescents, risk-taking is several things. First of all, it is adaptive. It does probably help you deal with challenges and stresses and strains of not only adolescence, but adulthood. It also is believed to be a normative trait. Some of us are very low risk takers. Some of us are very high risk takers, but most of us have an average sweet spot, kind of a middle of the bell-shaped curve type of risk taking. And it's quite actually normal and healthy to have a certain amount of risk taking. If you have too little or too much, that could lead to problems. But people do differ. So even if you're in the middle group, which probably represents 80–90% of us of risk taking, there's some that are at the low and some at the high end of that group. But the other thing about adolescence and risk taking is that it doesn't look like the kind of reckless risk taking we might see among teenagers, not due because they don't understand risk. The belief is that it's because of emotionality and contextual factors. And that was highlighted a couple slides back when I showed you how experts weighing in and trying to think of cognitive abilities with and without emotionality. With emotionality, decision making can really look quite different, and probably in an unhealthy way. This is reflected in how we understand driving among young people. So I'm going to start with this Allstate ad for May of 2007. It says, "Why do most 16-year-olds drive like they're missing a part of their brain?" is the question. And the ad says, "Because they are." Now look over here, you can see the hole in the brain, which is shaped in a Volkswagen Beetle. That is part of the prefrontal cortex. They had a neuroscientist help them out, because if you want to think about, well, where's kind of the weakness of the teen brain, as it's developing, it tends to be in this front part where some of this second thought, very important impulse control decision making occurs. This ad also highlights the importance of having certain kinds of restrictions on driving when you're a new driver. And so many of us probably are now familiar with these graduated driver licensing restrictions. If you look at the features that states have implemented, you, I think, see that they're quite wise, because they're highlighting restrictions that help in many ways the teen brain, which isn't all that good about driving when there's too much emotionality, when there's too many options to get distracted, etc. A driving study highlighted this. This is data that is from simulated driving context. So all the data about risky decisions, which is the set of bars over here, and the set of bars over here are a number of crashes. This is not real risky decisions or real crashes. It's all what was measured while individuals were in a simulated driving lab, and they were asked to do certain things with a simulated car. The three groups were compared: adolescents, young adults, and adults. And in condition A, they all were in the lab engaging in certain kinds of driving challenges, and they had their risky decisionness and how many simulated crashes occurred were measured. And so those the blue bars. The height of the blue bars are relatively similar, and they're not showing a statistical difference. And what's of importance is the adolescents, who are the more naive drivers, they're doing just as good, even better than the other two age groups. But condition B is when they were allowed to come back to the lab in the simulated situation, and they were asked to bring a friend to sit next to them as a simulated passenger. Well, and they were again asked to engage in these challenges, risky decisions. The number of crashes were measured, and who did the worst, or where was there a peer effect? Just in the adolescent group. That's why the red bars are much higher compared to the red bars in the young adults and adults. So older, more experienced or more mature teen brain individuals did a better job of handling a peer sitting next to him or her than the adolescents, who look to be under influence of having a friend in the car with them. And this is without music, multiple friends, having a driver or passengers intoxicated, or without even any encouragement to engage in emotionality. So you can see how some of these things can have a negative impact on adolescent. We will return to this if we have time, but I'm gonna move us right to the second part of my talk, which is the core part of the talk. Hang on here, let's get there we go. Okay, so hang in there. Well, the marshmallow test, we'll return to it if we have time. So this part of the talk is taking what I said earlier and now intersecting it with three main themes. One is, how does the developing brain relate to drug use, risk to use or risk for a drug use problem? How does it relate to mental health? And then what's the role of early experiences on the developing brain? So we're going to start with developing brain and drugs. There's a lot being studied on this topic. You can imagine it's tough to do perfect studies, but several lines of evidence can be garnered to look at this. The big question asked is, are adolescents more susceptible than adults to drugs? So all humans, to some degree, less or greater degree, are susceptible to the effects of drugs. But if you want to look at how does adolescence and adolescent brain development impact on that, you would need to really compare it to adults. So several lines of evidence. Some of them are human studies, although they're not perfect. They're very correlational, or they're based on epidemiological data. And some of the data come from animal studies that we'll get into. So one piece of evidence comes from survey data or epidemiological studies. And if you just track the popularity of substance use by humans in modern times in America, you basically, for most of us, you find that you peaked your substance use during your adolescent years. Before adolescence and after adolescence, you weren't using as heavily. Now, some of us, of course, escalated and continued on and perhaps had problems. But for most of us, the natural history is you're peaking your use during the teen years. So that's just something's going on in the teen years. Perhaps brain development's part of it, many other things that increase the interest in using and also lead for most of us to use at the heaviest levels that we have used in our life. If you look at another survey type set of data, you'll see how youthful use is a risk for having a downstream problem with addiction. So two sets of bars here. The light green is alcohol bar, and the, I guess that's purple is the marijuana data. And what's being looked at here is the relationship of age of starting to use and the risk of having a problem with that drug later in life. So let's just go to the far left. You can see that it's the highest set of bars, whether it's for alcohol or marijuana. And this reflects data that is the following. For those that started to use either alcohol or marijuana before age 13, the risk of having eventually a problem later in life with that drug is quite elevated, almost 50% for alcohol and around 15% for marijuana. And you can see how the risk profile trajectory significantly drops as you wait to start using later and later. And so just compare the two endpoints. And if you waited till 21 or older to start using alcohol or marijuana, you can see the risk of having a problem sometime in your life is so much lower than if you started early, suggesting that youth is a risk period. So most of the data for our look at adolescents and risk for substance use focuses on alcohol and then another set of data on cannabis. So I'm going to just walk you through those two substances quickly. Animal studies have been used with this issue of adolescence and alcohol. Adolescent rats can get intoxicated and you can measure their behavior. And so one set of studies has looked at what's called the acute effects of alcohol or the sedative effects. And you can measure motor impairment and sedation in adolescent rats and compare that to adult rats. And so what happens is that the adolescent rats can handle their alcohol better than the adult rats. So that's, now they're controlling, of course, for prior exposure and controlling for weight. So isn't that interesting? And they measure it with this water maze test. This is a cartoon provided from Dr. Harris. It's just one way to measure sedation and motor coordination, the ability of the rat to swim around and find the little platform. Rats don't like to swim or be in water, so they'll be motivated to find the platform to get above the water. Adolescent rats do a better job in this task than the adult rats when intoxicated. That's kind of interesting. A second set of findings looks at social behavior. So you can measure how sociable rats are. You can get them intoxicated and then compare adolescent and adult rats, and you find that there is some age differences. So both sets of animals are more sociable when they're intoxicated, but the adolescent rats show it to a greater degree. So the principle is the adolescent rats show more sensitivity to the social disinhibitory effects of alcohol. So think of principles, actually below I've got the wrong numbers. I'm really referring to principles 1 and 2. It surely could contribute to adolescents being interested and able to be heavier drinkers than adults are. So if you're not feeling acute effects of alcohol and you're feeling great social rewards, that might surely encourage you to binge drink. And binge drinking behavior is more prevalent in young people than adults, even though adults are more experienced drinkers. What's the impact of that? Well, one study that illustrates this, it comes from a longitudinal investigation that had a sample of young people. They had 3 measurement time points, 14, 16, and 19. And then they had neuroimaging data on some of the sample, but they also had personality data on all of them. And then they had a lot of binge drinkers in the sample, and they compared what are called the long-term binge drinkers versus the short-term versus those that were the controls. And the findings are, perhaps as you might expect, the long-term binge drinkers, they had neuroimaging data that showed more disruption in their brain developments, particularly in the maturation of the frontal connectivity. Part of the brain that's a prefrontal cortex, that's the important decision-making part of the brain. Personality data showed that those that were the heaviest binge drinkers had slower developmental improvement of impulse control. So impulse control, the heavy lifting for that comes from the front of the brain. So kind of an interesting coherence of data here, where the neuroimaging data and the personality findings reflected that heavy binge drinking might have a negative impact on both the maturation structure-wise of your brain, and that may actually translate behavior-wise to showing poorer control of impulses. Now, it's not fate. So as people are following individuals downstream, and particularly after they cut back or stop alcohol use, the trait of impulse control can improve. We're going to know more about that, as you can imagine, from that ABCD study. Okay, a little focus on marijuana. This is quite important because people get concerned of the impact of using cannabis on the brain and brain maturations. So THC, or the intoxicant chemical in cannabis, impacts multiple regions of the brain. This is a representation of it. On the left are the various parts of the brain that are impacted. So when you get high, it makes sense that there's all kinds of impact on sensation, memory, how you perceive rewards, motor coordination, and the judgments you make. One way to highlight the concern about young people using cannabis comes from a summary of the research by Nora Volkoff, the director of NIDA, and her colleagues. They published this in 2014. And they looked at the data that was linking cannabis use and the possible negative health impacts. And so they found enough data to comment on 8 health impacts, and then they categorized them according to the extent to which the level of confidence of the science was low, medium, or high with respect to marijuana or cannabis being a negative influence or negative impact on these health outcomes. So you can see that not everything had a medium or high level of confidence, but several met at least their standards of what was already something we should be worried about. Well, they also, in the article, commented when they thought the evidence showed that if use of cannabis began during adolescence, the health impact would be more pronounced. And they highlighted these 4: altered brain development, increased risk of chronic psychosis disorders, including schizophrenia and depression, in persons with predispositions. So it altered the path of those that are predisposed. High level of confidence for addiction with cannabis. And then interesting, diminished life satisfaction and achievement, including cognitive impairment and poor educational outcome. So having downstream impact on the extent to which a person says they're satisfied with life, or they feel like they have achieved a lot in terms of occupation, income, and social achievement. So they highlighted these 4. Interesting study that I'm going to spend just a moment on looked at the potential negative impact of using cannabis on somebody's IQ. So this comes from New Zealand, called the Dunedin study. About 1,000 subjects were in this longitudinal sample, measured at 5 different time points, starting with age 13, and then, as I note here, you got age 18, 21, 32, and 38. I put in red the 2 years, the 2 endpoints where IQ was measured. So at age 13, before anyone had used substances, IQ is measured, and then a developmentally adjusted IQ is readministered at age 38. And then I've highlighted in green the assessment data points where cannabis was included in the survey: 18, 21, 32, and 38. Now, I boxed 18 because if the individual said they'd already used cannabis at least once, they also were asked, so when did you initiate your use? How old were you when you onsetted your use? So the use of cannabis and how early in life you started to use was looked at in terms of possible changes in IQ from age 13 to 38. And this somewhat complicated slide reflects that, that data. The big takeaway here was there was, on average, a drop of 8 IQ points in the individuals that had the following. They started to use cannabis early in life, before at age 18. They used heavily, not only in young adulthood, but throughout adulthood. And so heavily that they met a diagnosis for cannabis use disorders 3 times out of the 4 adult assessment points. So early onset and heavy use on average led to an IQ drop of about 8 points. That's significant because it's more than a half a standard deviation. If you waited till after adolescence to use cannabis, even if you were heavy, you had hardly any or 0 IQ loss. So that's kind of the good news story. But it does reflect and remind us adolescence is a risk period. So I spun some paths of data that try to address the question, are adolescents more susceptible than adults to drugs? Several lines of evidence. It's not definitive, of course. There is, I think, strong suggestion that yes, that is a risk period and creates a greater susceptibility to the negative impacts if one initiates during youth. Many have weighed in and said, well, why is that? If there is an increased susceptibility, what's going on? What's behind it? And on one level, you could make a case that normal adolescence, with the way adolescent behaviors tend to flow, and perhaps the way the brain development tends to bias certain perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors that might contribute to risk, to be curious to use and to continue to use. So back to my list of 8, I've highlighted and shown you again the 7 out of the 8 that are in red that I earlier called just risk for negative health decisions and negative health outcomes. I think we can overlay that now and talk about that as risk for substance use. Then there's the concern that the reward pathway region of the brain that's heavily influenced by dopamine, an important neurotransmitter, which is impacted by drugs of abuse, that region is more sensitive and more profoundly impacted when drugs are introduced, when the brain is developing. So we're all in lesser or greater degrees susceptible to the influence of psychoactive substances because we have a reward pathway region with dopamine that gets overexcited when we introduce drugs. And that overexcitation leads to a lot of rewarding feelings and outcomes. But these effects, these rewarding effects, are hypothesized to be even more pronounced among teenagers because they have a more hypersensitive dopamine system. So if something's more rewarding, you might do it more often. You might ignore negative consequences more readily, and thus you might start a cascade of problems that leads to overuse, indulgence, and even dependence. So the one concern is that adolescent brain is just neurochemically more susceptible. There's also the problem and concern that maybe you're altering the brain when you're using during the teen years that alters that maturation that contributes to a priming the pump or a gateway effect towards increased rewards and increased interest in using when you're an adult. So you might be altering brain structures that can be with you for many years. So on the left is summary of data that's looking at nicotine. So this is just nicotine drug, not others, but it showed that that there was a big difference in how much nicotine was self-administered to 2 different groups of rats based on whether they got nicotine exposure during adolescence or not. So that's what you see represented in these two different bars. This bar represents the group of rats that during adolescence was exposed to nicotine, and their number of self-administration doses in a given period of time averaged to be 10. Over here is the group that during adolescence was not administered any nicotine, and they were just given the first option to self-administer nicotine during adulthood. And you can see they were only interested in it, if I can put a human trait to rats, at about half the level that the pre-exposed rats were. So a concern that this pre-exposure isn't just a learning impact, but might have led to some priming, biological priming, that contributed to an elevated risk as adulthood. I'll skip this because it says pretty much the same thing. So let's look at the second big point, brain development and behavioral disorders. It's worthy of our concern because so many mental and behavioral disorders have adolescence as its onset. I've got a list here of some of the big ones. And this is surely contributed to many experts thinking that, is that because maybe something is going wrong? Maybe there's some alterations or disruptions in the normal brain maturation process that contributes to the early onset of some of these behavioral disorders. If you look at the lifetime risk of having certain disorders, you can see that many of them do onset during the youth years. So this is putting a little bit more science and numbers to the earlier slide. This was a national survey that asked people about lifetime experiences with various mental and behavioral disorders. And then if they had any symptoms or met criteria, they were asked, well, when did you first have symptoms of those disorders? So these four bars represent a summary of these type of data. And the numbers represent what's called a 50 percentile of age of onset. It's one way of saying, what's the average age of onset for people who during their life, they had an impulse disorder, had an anxiety disorder, had a substance use disorder, or any mood disorder. And so what's the mean age at which they had the first experience with those disorders? They might have had it multiple times or just once, but this is just showing you the first time they had it. And you can see three of them have some very high relationship to youth. One of them is a little bit later in life, but even with this being the median or average, that means still many people had it during our youth. I've just overlaid what is this is a sidebar point, what's the projected lifetime risk by age 75 that you might have one of these disorders. And this was the estimate from the sciences that conducted this study. Okay. It is very relevant to look at marijuana and behavioral disorders. That's getting a lot of attention, more so than alcohol. So I'm just going to go down a few paths with you that speaks to the importance of understanding the health impact of early use, early initiation of marijuana and mental illness. On a general level, if you consider risk for psychosis, there is an intersection of how soon in life you've used marijuana and then your risk of having psychosis. And this is represented in these bars. So what's the numbers on the top of the bars? That is the prevalence of individuals who said in the last year they had psychosis as a function of when they started to use marijuana. So you can see the bad news. The earlier, those that used marijuana, age 12 or younger, the earliest group, 21% of them had a episode of psychosis that could be schizophrenia or paranoid personality disorder within the past year. And you can see the risk drops significantly if you wait till later. Obviously, a lot of people had psychosis without marijuana use, and a lot of people use marijuana without psychosis, but you can see there still is a probabilistic risk relationship. This is a slide that reflects the fact that if you compare alcohol and cannabis, you see a significant negative impact of how cannabis can contribute to an earlier onset of having a psychotic disorder. So the data here are from all individuals who are suffering from psychosis and have already in their life, but they're asked if they've used substances, and then if they have, how early in life did you have your first episode of psychosis? So the 2.7 number above the cannabis bar means that for those that had psychosis and used cannabis as a teenager, their first episode of psychosis was 2.7 years earlier, almost 3 years earlier than those that didn't use cannabis in their teen years. So people still had psychosis, of course, if you didn't use cannabis, but if you use cannabis, that contributed to a likelihood of having your first experience with psychosis almost 3 years earlier. So imagine that you're suffering from a very serious disorder 3 more years than somebody else who didn't use cannabis. And it also perhaps negatively impacts on downstream course of your psychosis. You might have more episodes, etc. Alcohol didn't have an effect in this age of onset, but cannabis, the culprit here. I'll skip this because I'm going to go right to right here. This is the perhaps the most interesting and recent data on looking at cannabis and psychosis. This showed that it's not just using cannabis, but it's how risk is altered in a bad way if the more potent cannabis that you use. So there's 5 bars. The lightest colored represents the group that had never used cannabis. And then the number above it is the mean age. Let's see if I get my pointer here. Come on. The mean age onset of psychosis, their first episode of psychosis. So never used cannabis, the mean age was 31. Go all the way down to the far right, the green, the worst news. This is those that were everyday skunk users. That's a term from England. Some kids here in America use that term, but it's the high potent hash, the most potent THC. It's probably THC levels above 50%. Anyways, the mean age of onset was 25. Look at the 2 differences, almost 8 years, or 6 to 8 years. More potent use of cannabis, earlier onset. If you didn't use, you at least had a later onset. A little healthier, a little bit more easier course of your psychosis, not as healthy in a much more negative course. So let's be cautious though. All the data I've shown is correlational. And early drug use may be a marker of underlying genetic risk. So it might not be causative in a very strict sense, or it may only be partially causative. And that last phrase reflects the thinking of some that you may have a genetic predisposition for psychosis and other serious disorders, including depression and anxiety. If you use marijuana, it just increases your risk of having that disorder, or as I've shown you, it increases the risk of you having an earlier onset and a worse course of that disorder. So how about early experiences? That's the third big point I want to hit home for you. I'm reminded of the important quote from Anderson: exposure to both positive and negative elements before adolescence can imprint on the final adult topography in a manner that differs from exposure to the same elements after adolescence. So it speaks to the relative importance of impact on the developing brain. So obviously can be acute impact of positive and negative experiences to a person. But during adolescence, these experiences perhaps can have an impact on how the brain is maturing. And so genetics play a role. but of course, if, as the Harvard group reminds us, if there is exposure to sustained stress-inducing experiences early in life, that can lay the foundation for mental illness, and that can endure well into the adult years. So it's probably why we do see many mental disorders have adolescent onset. And many of them perhaps have been triggered by stress. Genetic factors surely have an underlying role in many of them, but stress can be a triggering factor. But the Harvard folks remind us of the rays of hope, because some individuals demonstrate remarkable capacities to overcome the severe challenges of early persistent maltreatment, trauma, and emotional harm. Most potential mental health problems will not become mental health problems if we respond to them early. And that response can be both from good prevention as well as early treatment. So let me go down a path of where early experiences can alter brain development in positive ways, and then we'll look at some negatives. But CDC reminds us that there is a growing literature on how there's so many positive experiences that can alter brain development in very resilient ways. Nurturing and responsive care for the child's body and mind is the key to supporting healthy brain development. One study out of many, just going to hone in on the interest of researchers to look at maternal support. So this was looking at mother support and how that might have an impact among preschoolers downstream. So maternal support was measured, and then they looked at groups that had high maternal, moderate, and low maternal support, and they looked at development of an important part of the brain called the hippocampus. So this one research study looked at that region of the brain. So they're measuring hippocampus at the baseline and then measuring longitudinally to see if there's a relationship in the development of that part of the brain based on maternal support. So hippocampus is important for memory and learning. So it's a key region of the brain to look at when you're thinking of young people and health. So the good news was the more paternal support was associated with more hippocampus volume. And hippocampus volume is great because it leads to better memory and most likely downstream learning, but it also was found to be associated with better emotional regulation. So that's a very important asset feature for someone to have. So a wonderful environmental feature linked to brain maturation, and then that was linked to important behavioral outcomes. Just and of course, there's some downside to all of this because negative experiences likely have also an impact on brain development. General literature, shows how it can have an impact on learning problems, substance abuse, and increased use of all kinds of services. One recent study looked at how orphans who go through a lot of stress and of course don't have a lot of maternal or paternal support compared to those that were raised with parents, and you can see some of the negative impacts, increased symptoms in the gut and a pattern of gut microbiomes that was linked to anxiety. And so an example where it's probably a negative impact having a biological downstream outcome, and that can lead to behavioral issues. But the good news, these things are not fate. And now people are measuring how young people that have been exposed to a lot of stress or trauma that might show up as acute behavioral problems can show a much more positive path, whether they do it through their own resilience, whether it's within families, assets, or with professional help. So implications for youth service providers. Remember, there were 6 of them, so I'm going to spin them with a little more detail. So you might remember I emphasize what I thought was some wonderful value of teaching young people about brain development, and it's important for their health and well-being. A lot of features and principles that I think you already heard me talk about, you could see would be really good to get teenagers to think about and talk about. If one of the big themes I take away from brain development science is to show them how the way their brain is developing can lead them towards very adaptive and healthy decision making, and how you want to take that exciting young brain and use it to take good risks, how you want to make sure that you're careful about not letting the strength you have in your brain to engage in second thought. You have skills on second thought, but don't let the emotional situations or context get the best of you, and not let peer pressure have you engage in unhealthy patterns, including delinquency. So the teen brain is very, I think, attuned to wanting to take good risks, and it can engage in good second thought, just good decision making, and it's able to avoid peer pressure. But the teen brain sometimes is prone not to do those things, and you want to teach the teenager about how there's this pull between the Nike part and the decision making part, and you don't want to let that Nike part take over. If you're interested in a resource where you could use this to teach young people about brain development, it's a great classroom resource. I think it's helpful also if you're doing group therapy or prevention programs. Just email me at that email and I'll send you this free resource. It provides you with a PowerPoint file so you can walk through some of these basic principles with the teenagers. It has several exercises so you can engage them, and it has some handouts. It also, this resource includes a parent component. So if you're working with parents, or you want to give a parent talk and teach them about teen brain development, which I'll emphasize pretty soon, I give you some resources for that. So it's a free package. Feel free to email me and I'll send it to you. A reminder, if you're working in prevention, there are several great resources so you can make sure you're using evidence-based programs. I've listed 3 of them here, but the one that's from NIDA, and there's the website and there's the cover of the handbook, I think is a great one. It's a free download and it provides for you, I think there are 13 principles or keys to effective prevention. And then it gives you on the back of the manual a list of some of the evidence-based programs. You are probably all familiar with the principle that the earlier the treatment, the better. So it's very healthy for that teen brain to get help for whether it's a substance use or mental health problem, and get that healthy maturation back on the right track. The bars over here are just showing you the importance of getting treatment for a substance use disorder as early as possible. So the blue line here is the most favorable. This just reflects the fact that if you get treatment within the first 9 years of when you have the first problem with substance use, obviously there's a long period of time, 0 to 9, but anywhere within the first 9, you can really improve your ability to quickly get to abstinence. As opposed to if you wait 20 or more years to get treatment, your pathway to abstinence is just much longer. This principle probably holds for most of the mental and behavioral disorders. Hopefully you appreciate the fact that using evidence-based treatment can optimize your outcomes with young people. There now are a lot of summaries and publications that provide you with a good idea of what are evidence-based practices. I've put in red back to NIDA. They have another publication that's about evidence-based treatment. So I'm just showing you that publication here. And on the left are the three main treatment approaches that the manual highlights. If one were to use these three principles when treating young people, motivational interviewing, CBT approaches in a family treatment context, you probably are optimizing your treatment for young people, and you surely would be matching the principles that NIDA says are evidence-based. One reason I like cognitive behavior therapy and motivational interviewing is I think they're very helpful in giving insight to the adolescent and their teen brain on how to be good with risk-taking, or how to be good with self-regulation, another way of talking about risk-taking. So I've just listed 5 different ways that are similar to the prior list. Things you want to steer teenagers towards, skills that will help a teenager with making sure their teen brain does not get the best of them, but also capitalizing on the strengths of their teen brain. This slide is not real. It's just my joke. But if somebody said, Winters, you can set up a new 12-step program. You don't have to follow the 12 steps that come from AA. What would the 12 steps be? And I might set it up around 12 steps of self-regulation, I'm calling, or maybe another way of saying 12 steps of healthy risk-taking. And so I've come up with 12 ways of detailing that. They overlap a little bit, but it's just one other way of me saying using evidence-based programs and honing in on helping teens with good decision-making, I think will optimize your outcomes. 2 more principles or ways the science can help you. One is to, the 5th is to help teenagers get smarter about cannabis use and vaping. So I've listed 2 sources here of where you could go to these websites and come up with a myth buster or a quiz with young people to engage them in a discussion and hopefully more thoughtful perceptions about cannabis and vaping. My fear is that too many teenagers do not think it's very harmful to use cannabis or to vape, but I think there's a lot of good reasons to disabuse him or her and to get them to think about the health implications of using cannabis and vaping. Okay, the last principle is teaching parents about brain development. Feel free to use this as a handout. It's in that Teen Brain resource that I can send you for free. This is a key activity I do with parents. I have them break off into groups. Each group has a letter that they're assigned to, and they are to talk about the principle to that letter and then come up with examples of what they might do as a parent to help advance that principle. So in all of these principles revolve around being a good parent, being good at parenting, promoting assets in a teenager, and promoting healthy lifestyle. I also point parents to some good parent resources. All of these are for free and online. I put number 1, the partnership at drugfree.org. They just have covered so much territory with great content. But NIDA, which is number 2, is a great one. And then a great resource from the group Preventing Teen Drug Use. To summarize, hopefully you can appreciate that adolescence is an extended period of transition from reliance on adults to independence, to breaking free from adults. And normal adolescence is characterized by these features here. Many of them are, I think, driven by how the brain develops and how that impacts behaviors and attitudes. But all of these features listed here are quite normal. They may frustrate parents and teachers and make it difficult for teens to recognize they might have a substance use or behavioral problem, but it's part of normal adolescence. And these are things we all have to deal with. try to address and try to sometimes, or to some degree, steer towards health and steer away from unhealthiness. One way I summarize teen brain development is that there's a greater interest in reward incentives than perceptions of consequences, a greater dominance of thinking about what's the fun in what I'm doing as opposed to what could be the danger or the problem. Or another way I summarize it is showing you the Nike sign. I think there's several lines of evidence suggesting that adolescence is a period of vulnerability to the effects of drugs. I highlighted alcohol and cannabis to some degree. Also, nicotine is in the picture because there's science underlying that as well. And when maturation goes awry, it may lead to vulnerability to some mental disorders. And then one concern is that using drugs can unfortunately alter that maturation, and that might just compound somebody's risk towards mental disorders. And then I talked about ways you can take the teen brain science, you can turn it into and use it to strengthen your prevention and treatment efforts. Fortunately, there's just a wealth of evidence-based programs. I think the best, the ones that get evidence-based labels, they didn't formally perhaps understand teen brain science, but I think they capitalize on teen brain science in a favorable way to increase engagement and learning. I think it's also of great value to just directly talk about teen brain development to young people. I think it engages them, gets them interested in science, and hopefully encourages them to take healthy paths. So let's just go to the quiz. And then if there's time and people have interest, we can have some discussion. So the first question was a true false. Now, I didn't directly talk about this, but it turns out the answer to the question, there are several health indices suggesting that teenagers take less risk than in past years. It's true. So there are some interesting and I think encouraging signs that in many ways teenagers are taking less risk. One indice is there's an increased rate, a prevalence rate is increasing of teenagers that say they're abstaining from all substances throughout their adolescent years. There's also a lower rate of teenage pregnancies we've been seeing, and certain delinquency behaviors are also showing a decline. Obviously, some things are on the increase, and the big one is cannabis use and vaping. So we're losing some momentum on those two fronts. Second question, what lifestyle choices during adolescence promote good brain development? Here's my list. Experts vary to some degree on what they put on this kind of list. You'll see I did put no drug use, but there's a lot of other things. And some of them are very basic, just a good diet, sufficient sleep, involvement in music, whether you play it or listen to it, being active with exercise and sports, connecting to one's community and culture is also very important for health and brain development. So that can be for sure native culture. It can be community activities, and even family, of course, family activities and milestones and traditions are all very important. I put learned resiliency skills because there's just a great interest now in what is the secret sauce of resilience and how important it is to teach these skills as people go through adolescence and adulthood. Then the last one, which is more harmful to the developing brain? Is it heavy chronic use of marijuana or cannabis, or is it heavy drinking, heavy binge drinking? It's really a good question because so far it's not clear. I would say both of them are not good for the developing brain, but it's probably, an irrelevant question to try to compare the two, because they both have significant problems. But I do get asked this because I think people want to think that, well, if I'm not using an illicit drug like THC, I'm okay if I drink heavily. Not necessarily. Of course, some teens might think cannabis is even safer than drinking, because you often get from teenagers, well, you can't overdose from cannabis, and I'm not a terrible driver when I'm high on THC, etc. So they may favor the view that cannabis is safer. Okay, that was a lot. I took up a lot of the time. If people have interest in some Q&A, I'd be more than happy to engage.
Well, Ken, I want to just say thank you very much for this great presentation. We do have a few minutes left. Jeff, did we see any questions coming in? I was making a lot of comments. I was really enjoying some of your slides, Ken. Some of the data is extremely interesting, and really appreciate this. And the Cheech and Chong pictures were fun too. That's a movie I just have to watch again at some point. Anyway, we've got a few minutes for questions. You can unmute, or you can post something in the chat. We're happy to have Ken address those.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrea from Hopi Behavior Health. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I will be reaching out to you for that curriculum. The age first used out here, and it's probably pretty similar across reservations, is really early. We've not analyzed all our data, but we have kids reporting early use as of 7 or 8 years old, and then it's pretty chronic use by the time they're 10, 11. So this education to parents is really critical to provide.
Yes.
I keep trying to find a resource that's not so heavy, and then people get lost in the information regarding brain development, something that's user-friendly.
Thank you for your comment, Andrea. I'm hoping the free resource or curriculum that we offer would provide you with, both for teenagers and parents, a
Yes.
user-friendly overview of brain development and why it's important to lead a healthy lifestyle, including no drug use during those teen years. NIDA has resources along those lines, but they tend to be a little technical. Oh, by the way, the TED Talk too is a great, and I include it now in the parent resource, the link to it, because it's a great way for you as a presenter to spend some time talking to the audience, but also to have, a 8-minute video to show. And Sarah Blake Moore just does a fantastic job of detailing in a very understandable way. But you've emphasized the importance of parents, because I think when you're talking about even preteens starting to use it, most likely the preventive entry point are parents, I would think. And so any way you can emphasize to parents how they've got to stay on top of this is an extremely dangerous path for their young people. How the long-term consequences can be quite daunting when you think about it, is vital. So feel free, of course, to send me an email. Everyone can get the resource, and I'm more than happy to help people think through how to present it if they have some questions.
Thank you.
Andrea, I put that TED Talks link right in the chat there.
Oh, good.
I think that's the one Ken's referring
Yeah.
to.
Yep. Sarah Jane Blakemore. Yeah.
Blakemore, yes.
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, okay. we want to make sure we honor everyone's time. We are at the bottom of the hour. And again, I want to thank Ken Winters for being here. It's great to go over this curriculum again with you. You've got a great presentation style. So thank you so much, Ken. Great information. I want to thank Jeff for supporting, and I want to also thank everyone that was in attendance today. Your continued patronage and support of our center is appreciated. So I did post a short GIPRA survey link in the chat box as well. If you don't have time to do that now, we will reach out to you post-event with a PDF copy of these slides, as well as a request for CEUs. If you would like CEUs, just respond to that email and we'll get that certificate out to you. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of the afternoon. And until we meet again, please stay safe, stay connected, and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve and Jeff and group. Have a great weekend, everyone.